My thoughts to share here today regard some crucial theological and philosophical roots of the ethics of contemporary postmodernism or wokeism, which can be considered as the strongest expression of a relativist moral discourse where mere the words virtue and vice run the risk of being seen as repressive or offensive. Virtue and vice as concepts represent a moral realism, that is, a belief in the presence of an objective morality as something for the individual to get to know, embrace, and order his or her life towards. The insight that things that I happen to like, feel for, and want do not necessarily constitute goodness. A somewhat humorous description of the today culturally dominant opposite, woke position was given by an online meme that some year ago was widely shared in various Catholic social media. It describes, this meme, a fictive dialogue between a person and the Catholic Church, and it goes like this. Person, I want to do X. Catholic Church, you are free to do it. Person, but you think X is wrong. Catholic Church, yes. Person, because you want to control me. Catholic Church, no, you are free to do what you want. Person, but you think X is wrong. Catholic Church, yes, but only because I want your ultimate good. Person, but I want to do X. Catholic Church, you are free to do it. Person, but I want you to say that X is good. Catholic Church, I cannot say that. Person, why do you hate me? The meme caught a central point of contemporary Western moral understanding. There is hardly any vice, and only one virtue, namely tolerance, narrowly defined as an active sympathy with most of what another person freely chooses to do. And this is important to note the difference. It's not a support of the freedom itself, the freedom to choose, it's the support of every product of this freedom. And if such an active sympathy is lacking, or even worse, if anyone dares to question another person's choices with some sort of argument of general goodness, it represents a phobia or even hate that must be fought by highly intolerant methods, like, above all, forced confession of sympathy or cancellation. How did we get here? There are, of course, multiple causes and connecting chains, but an important, however often overlooked, contribution is provided by the philosophical and theological essence of the Protestant Reformation, inevitably leading to a revision of the understanding of morality within a Christian context. This has weakened the philosophical resistance against mindsets influenced by ideas culminating in the Renaissance, ideas that in turn further have inspired Protestantism. The rejection of the Catholic understanding of the role of good works or deeds in salvation is, you can say, the hallmark of Martin Luther's most influential protest. When salvation, justification in Luther's terminology, is a matter of faith only as inner disposition, an act of the intellect, faith alone, or sola fide in Latin as battle cry, then the second tablet of the Decalogue is obscured, as the great Catholic theologian Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, once rightly summarized it. The second tablet is the tablet regulating the content of our acts, our deeds. If deeds are unimportant for our eternal good, they also logically lack significance for eternal damnation. This paves the way for a new kind of Christian moral theological thinking, among others concretely expressed in a school of thought called the fundamental option. Put simply, it holds that I, of course, ought to avoid doing bad things in the extent that they can be defined at all, of course, but that bad actions will not threaten my salvation if I fundamentally have opted for Christ in my heart, as it were. Faith is confirmed as a pure spiritual act of the mind. I sit in the pew in the church and I believe. The early Protestant abolition of confession and practices of penance is hereby crowned and a way is paved for a religious blessing of an individualistic understanding of good and bad. With the establishment of Protestant national churches, with worldly rulers as heads, the Church as mediator of faith and morals, explaining Christian virtues, warning of vices, providing help for the journey of the faithful to see and walk the path towards salvation, does no longer speak with one voice. Without one single teaching office under the Pope, there will in the long run not be one Christian message. The multiple state churches have been equipped with models of governance based or fully dependent on national politics, including matters of doctrine and moral teaching. And when the worldly politics is secularized, so are the church communities with political governance. There is therefore a straight line from the 16th century Swedish king Gustav Vasa to the political parties today defining faith in the Swedish Lutheran church community. This essential politicization explains why most of the present or former Protestant state churches today proclaim moral virtues that are secular or secularly inspired, contrary to traditional Christian teaching in the areas of sexuality, marriage, and medical ethics. The rejection of tradition, upheld and reaffirmed by one single teaching office as a source of revelation of divine will, this rejection also opens up for a development of multiplying, that is, constantly new communities founded by new and at least by some acknowledged authorities and Bible interpretations. It is reasonable to hold that this multiplying biblical individualism has contributed to an almost official Swedish take on religion as something totally private. You can't say anything about it, and from there strengthened a general relativism. Throughout modernity, an emerging secularist environment with an individualist and relativist morality where virtues do not relate to an objective and unchanging moral order has been nourished by philosophies like Marxism and logical positivism, and has put increased pressure on Christianity. It now, today, shakes, for example, even the Swedish evangelical and Pentecostal movements in very fierce internal debates. This soil is prepared by philosophical currents already of the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. The interaction between the Renaissance emphasis on human sovereignty and an empirical scientific understanding of the world, first in a mechanical sense, accelerates a paradigm shift in metaphysics. A shift inspired by the 14th century Franciscan friar, finally excommunicated William of Ockham, whose philosophical worldview, nominalism, dismissing universal concepts corresponding to reality, Martin Luther later will come to share. Its most significant consequence is a rejection of different degrees of being, which forces the understanding of the relation between God and the created world to be guided by new criteria. God is no longer seen as the sheer act of being itself, as St. Thomas Aquinas holds it, in whose being all created physical beings participate in different and all lesser degrees. Instead, God is seen as a supreme being, that is, stronger, more powerful, and mostly invisible, but ontologically not separate from other beings. Parenthetically said, this is precisely the understanding of God that the Enlightenment movement later, and quite rightly, will revolt against with reference to empirical science. You can't empirically find this old man on top of a cloud. This changed thinking of being affects the thinking on freedom. First, the freedom of God, but from there, as humans still are created in God's image, also human freedom. The classical understanding sees in God the ultimate freedom, in the sense that all acts of God's will are ordered towards God's own essence of ultimate goodness. This means that God, as fully consistent with himself and thus fully free, cannot commit sinful acts or exhort humans to commit sins, because that would go against God's own nature. From this, human freedom is understood as the possibility to implement goodness and truth, not invented, but discovered and embraced by the individual through one's actions. Freedom, in other words, is a means to a particular objective goal, excellence. That is, a life according to the moral virtues. In religious terms, this is holiness or sainthood, a full share in the divine degree of being, something else, something more than what we are at the present. The rethinking of being and a more immanent placement of God, however, paves the way for seeing God's freedom as an expression of God's power, his most distinguishable feature. It is through active commandments of God's will that, for example, 2 + 2 = 4, that the outside world exists in my understanding, or an action is moral. If God would have wanted it differently, say that 2 + 2 would equal 3, or that infidelity is something good, then it would be so by the most powerful decision. Freedom, on the one hand, and goodness and truth, on the other, are now separated by the exercise of power. This is called voluntarism, from the will in Latin. With voluntarism, also human freedom can be seen as the exercising of choice. Freedom from every limitation, and thus ultimately also to indifference and relativism. If this is what I feel I want to do, who are you to say it is wrong? There is no argument here against including the very definition of goodness and truth in this freedom. On the contrary, freedom as the exercise of power is not to be limited to the choice of electricity supplier to my apartment. No, it covers everything, also me choosing my own sex, and between more than 2 alternatives, if I feel and want strongly enough power. Construction of reality itself is put in human hands. This is the ideology of Adam's and Eve's sin. And so, we have the path on which many will travel. Marx, Nietzsche, Sartre, Foucault, as well as legal positivism, just to mention a few, with the end station being the fictive dialogue between the person and the Catholic Church that I started with here. Just a quiet questioning of relativism offends the sovereign individual or collective agent, their freedom, and thus power, as it questions their whole being. And this woke sensitivity has now brought us to the end of moral argument and, unfortunately, risks making us less human. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas. What side would you like to be on here, honestly, if you take a look at this picture? The crusader fighting for the good, or rather an individual trying to seek some individual pleasure in life?
Well, where would you like to be?
In both places.
Well, pleasure is not wrong.
No.
But if pleasure is the goal for everything, then things tend to go wrong.
With this, I come back to the phrase, your ultimate good, that was mentioned in the meme. And
Yes.
What is the ultimate good, and who decides what it is?
God. God is the answer to both questions. God is the ultimate good, and he also gives us the answer to what it is.
Well,
and this is actually the fall of Adam and Eve, because they say, who are you to tell us how we're going to live our lives? And the tree of knowledge is not that, oh, God is against human knowing things. This is rubbish. The tree of knowledge is that human says, I define what is good and what is true.
But honestly,
That's God's... Yeah.
God has never told me this.
Oh, he has. You haven't listened.
Thank you, Thomas. No. Let's leave this.
He tells you through the prophets, and even if we don't believe that, he himself becomes a human. I mean, you can't tell more than he does on the cross. I mean, that's everything you need to tell. But, of course, moral truth doesn't need religion.
What is then good? What is the ultimate? What is the good in the ultimate good then? Is that worshipping God, being subservient to his will?
Yeah, because that is, I mean, God is the sheer act of being, to speak with St. Thomas Aquinas. There is nothing more good than to be, and to be in eternity. And as we heard here before, the key to human happiness, whatever we would call it, is that we understand the code. Who am I actually thought to become? We are not living in Sartre's world, where we come out and only exist and there is no code. I mean, if you take away religion, you can realize what is good without having to be faithful or Christian or religious. It helps, but it can also, we know also that there are a lot of religious persons who are not moral, and that there are a lot of non-religious persons who are moral. So it's something about our knowledge and our reason. So to become human, to become who we were supposed to become, that is the aim of the journey here, not to invent it.
And that is virtue.
Yeah, I mean, virtues come out of that.
Yeah. You talked about the Protestant church as meddling into secular affairs together with the earthly powers. But I could argue that the Vatican is very much also an earthly power, and that the Pope sometimes meddles into the war in Ukraine, etc. So what's the difference?
Well, I did not say that they meddle into secular politics. That was not my point. No. The point is they are guided by secular ideology, secular philosophy, when it comes to teaching, to doctrine, and to morals. And that's something else. Of course, churches and church leaders have always been tempted to do politics, and that is not my critique. The critique is that if you found church communities that no longer are in a contact with some sort of a divine revelation, which is the Catholic thought of the office of the Pope. It's not that Pope himself is divine, but that this office has it. If you cut that off, you need to put someone else at the top. And then they put the kings and the princes at the top, and that is now today the political parties. And that means not mingling into worldly affairs, but saying what is Christian faith or not. And that is now guided by secular principles and not by biblical or traditional Christian principles. That is my critique.
Can we even shorter describe the difference between Catholic virtue and Protestant virtue?
Well, I mean, I would say there is good Christian virtue, and that is to look at the person Jesus Christ. He's the most virtuous person because he is human as the human was thought to be, in fully communion with God and in his aim of doing God's will. And wherever you are Catholic or Protestant, you can look at Christ and you can try to form your life after that. With Catholicism, it's easier because you have all the helpful means. You have the sacraments, you have the saints and all of that. So why should you reject the help if this is the project? But all Christians can unite in that Christ is the model.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you.